Dan, let me just start with you for a point you've explained to me in the past. But for those pointing the finger at America and say you shouldn't be giving them cluster bombs, those are bad things, and now Russia has high ground in going after them, even on a civilian level. Your response?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chris. That's ludicrous that anybody would think that. First of all, cluster bombs and cluster munitions are two different things. Cluster bombs are airdropped from an aircraft and they're spread over a large area. Cluster munitions are artillery precise weapons that are dropped against enemy targets, in this case, Russian targets. So they're very different. They're confusing in the press. The 2008 Cluster Munitions Convention was basically, in my opinion, an asinine convention.
Hear you. Counterpoint. Ambassador Negroponte, first of all, it's great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me on the new show. It means a lot to me to have you here. I really appreciate your support. Now, do you agree with the analysis there in terms of America giving cluster munitions as opposed to cluster bombs to Ukraine? Was that the right move?
Well, the one part that came at a bit of a surprise to me is the statements that have been made that we're running out of other kinds of ammunition, like 155 artillery shells and so forth. So that surprised me a bit. I have no problem with providing the cluster munitions, provided it doesn't undercut popular political support for our efforts to continue to help Ukraine. In other words, if there was some kind of backlash here in the United States because we're doing this, that could have a psychological effect of undercutting our support for the war effort. I don't know how you address that question, but that would be a concern that I would have. I was in Vietnam as a civilian back in the 1960s, and I remember cluster bombs were used. I think they were used more in Laos than they were used elsewhere. And at one point or another, we desisted from using them further. But you know, I'm getting a little rusty in my memory about exactly what we did back then.
That's okay. The key, John, is that you understand the choice structure. And now you've given them cluster munitions. If Russia goes after a nuclear facility or ramps up civilian attacks and tries to claim high ground that, well, you're slaughtering us with these cluster munitions, so now it's okay. Does that change any calculus in your mind, John?
Well, I see our colleague here shaking his head. Maybe I should cede my place to him. Why don't you go ahead? I'm not as comfortable discussing cluster weaponry just because, I don't think I've talked about them for about 60 years.
Sir, it's an honor to be on with you.
Look,
and
ever the diplomat, he's deferring to you, Dan. So what do you think about that? If he takes out a nuclear facility now, or he starts to play the victim, what does that mean?
I think there's a lot of things in place here that we have to discuss, and one of them is the response of what Putin will do. You can't control that, so we can't control what Putin responds. Putin has invaded and illegally invaded Ukraine, and you can't control that. You can't control if he destroys a nuclear facility. What you can do is you can respond with proper means, and we are responding with the appropriate measured response. So I really think we're doing the right thing here. I'm glad the president has done this. There's a bipartisan support program to attack using cluster munitions.
Hey, thank you for watching. Please go to newsnationnow.com, newsnationnow.com, and you can find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button down below. Then you will get more of NewsNation's fact-driven coverage.